Friday early afternoon. My name is Jonathan Charles. I'm an international advisor on strategic communication and a member of the executive, former member of the executive of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. And for many decades before that, I was also a BBC foreign correspondent. I'm going to be introducing our distinguished panel very shortly, but first let me say a few words of introduction on our topic today. We are probably, I guess all of us, we need no reminding that the geopolitical challenges of our world are as demanding today as any of us can probably remember for many, many, many decades. We face so many different challenges. We are seeing shifts in global trade flows. The global environment is forcing countries to find new outlets to international markets and to diversify their traditional trade routes. In this context, the Middle Corridor, which we'll be discussing today, which connects Europe and Asia, has become an important route in diversifying and strengthening the connectivity on the Eurasian continent. The realization of that Middle Corridor potential depends on close coordination between all the stakeholders. That is going to be a tough ask all the way along the route. This is a potentially very long route. And of course, Kazakhstan in turn offers its own infrastructure to ensure uninterrupted trade flows along the route. And the capabilities of the Astana International Financial Center as well to structure deals, attract investments, facilitate cross-border transactions. We're going to be discussing all of this over the next hour or so. Let me introduce our speakers. We will start nearer here with Mirek Dusek, Managing Director of the World Economic Forum, who is sitting closest to me. Next to him, we have Shuja Hargitay, Managing Director for Central Asia of the EBRD. Next to her, we have Nurlan Soronbayev, the Chief Executive of Kazakhstan Railways. Next to him, we have Vivka Shloma, the Director for Central Asia and Turkey of the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, part of the World Bank Group. And at the very end, we have Dr. Yang Zhao, Managing Director of CICC Global Institute. Welcome to you all. Welcome to our discussion. I think before we come to specific questions, I'd like to ask you all maybe to make an opening statement as to how you see things. And set out, how you view this whole question of strengthening the Eurasian connectivity, this middle corridor. Mirek, maybe I'll come to you first because you're nearest to me.
Of course, thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here. And it's a particular pleasure to be here on this panel for what is a strategic project for Kazakhstan and this region overall. I thought I could maybe provide some reflections overall on the trends we see in international trade overall, just to kick us off. The World Economic Forum, we work on several global issues, and of course trade is one of them. There will be kind of three things I would like to talk about very briefly to describe the current landscape on trade globally. You mentioned at the beginning shifting trade patterns, and yesterday I was on a different panel here talking about economic growth, and I think there is this realization that we are in some kind of a transition economically in the world economy. And as I said yesterday, it's important that we realize, in my view, that this is not a linear transition. We really don't know exactly what the destination is. It is kind of shifting winds in that regard. And I think it's quite nicely illustrated on kind of the discussion and the discourse on global trade, because obviously you all read about the risk of fragmentation, the cost of fragmentation, that we see that countries are putting up barriers, etc. Ms. Georgieva mentioned, and rightly so yesterday, the cost that we would see out of decoupling and fragmentation. Having said that, I should mention, of course, and you may know it, that right now nominally we still see growth in global trade. You may know that nominally we saw, for example, a record year in the US-China trade of almost $700 billion. The one between China and Europe is around $600 billion or euros. It's just that nominally, I would like to underscore, we are still, of course, having major trade volumes that we are seeing in the economy. Having said that, obviously, we need to be aware of the risks and the headwinds, and we need to take some of those developments around nearshoring, offshoring, also developments around industrial policy, such as the latest developments, for example, in the US on Inflation Reduction Act. We need to take them seriously and understand what they will actually do to trade, because, of course, we want to make sure that we don't go to that scenario that Ms. Georgieva outlined in terms of huge costs to the global economy. And ultimately, as she said rightly, it's the main manifestation of that would be inflation, and obviously then would be hurting the most vulnerable. And then very briefly, just two, that's one big kind of trend we see, if you will, some kind of figuring out how to do resilience while still maintain trade and have growth out of trade. The second thing we are observing is, of course, digital. So there is both deploying of digital tools to facilitate trade, and I'm sure we'll talk about it in more detail later, but you can imagine what kinds of things those are. But also, there is the trade in digital services, which you may have seen yesterday. They signed this understanding between the UK and the US, and if you look at it, a big relief on both sides, I think, but particularly on one side, was the fact that there is also the agreement on data, so trans-border data flows is this holy grail of being able to work on digital services together. So that's number two. And number three, no surprise there, is also that trade is greener and really part of this whole momentum toward a net zero economy in the future. And there also, obviously, there are major efforts, but we need to do much more in terms of just greening the transportation links that we have in the global economy. We, for example, work quite a lot on things like green shipping and green fuels for aviation, etc. So those things, of course, are powering trade. But then the other, similar to digital, the other big factor, of course, is how then are you able, in your country or as a company, how are you part of that value chain around the new clean energy economy of the future? So obviously critical minerals, all kinds of things and shifts around the energy mix, the future of nuclear, that is relevant maybe here, and how suddenly in Europe we are waking up again to that. So just so that, again, as leaders, business leaders or governmental leaders are thinking about that, it's also how are we positioned to benefit and take advantage of what will be major trade in some of the commodities and of course then products within what will then be the clean energy economy of the near future and the then more distant future.
Marek, thank you very much indeed. Shuja, let me come to you, because the EBRD has just done a massive study with the European Union on the middle corridor. So what does that tell you about what's required here?
Jonathan, you will be pleased to hear that the study was not prompted by recent geopolitical tensions. What we were looking at is connection between Europe, Central Asia, and naturally going to China. So we were looking at trade patterns, changes in trade patterns pre-February 2022, and also how it could impact trade. So I negotiated a compromise with the organizers that I'm allowed to put up one slide, because I thought we all might benefit from looking at a map, at least one. So what we did together with our partners from the European Union under the European Union Global Gateways is to do a study. And we have come to some conclusions. The conclusions were presented roughly a month ago at the EU Central Asia Economic Summit. And we looked at essentially three alternative routes. One, which in Kazakhstan we call the middle corridor, which you will see it as number one. Number two is what we call the central corridor, and then the potential for the third corridor that we couldn't possibly look at because it's still nascent. Feasibility, pre-feasibility studies going on. And the first two corridors, again, you see it, they end in the port of Aktau, this is where my mandate ends. So please do not pester me too much in Azerbaijan and beyond. I will touch upon it when it comes to soft measures, but we looked at really the Central Asian connections. And all these three alternatives, let me say it very clearly, they do have their own advantages. Not mutually exclusive, but they are at different phase of development. And in fact, as EBRD, we are looking already at the first big projects along what we call the Northern Corridor. So one, the region is now, finally, strategically located between two regions, Europe, China, two significant economic powers. You've got a manufacturing base, and increasingly it's recognized that we are part of the global value chains, something that Mirek mentioned. Now, the region has direct access to Asia through multiple border crossings already, and it does have already an existing transport network. And what I mentioned to you, and why it was one of the main factors why we said, let's put emphasis on the Central Corridor, because the Central Corridor connects also major production centers in more than one country. Very simple. So you've got there, some people would call it Fergana Valley Plus, but you've got there Shymkent, Almaty, Toshkent, Namangan. So again, this is where we see the regional cooperation, supply chain enhancement coming for. So again, central route, we said already it has an extensive transport network. I already said that it crosses major population centers. And also, you will not call us EBRD if we did not have a look at the environmental and social impact of any new investments. And also, again, we look at, yes, fiscal affordability, and which I'll talk, I think, Vibke, I expect you to talk a lot, and Mr. Sarambayev about the headrooms that governments have to borrow and invest in something that essential network. And finally, there must be readiness to coordinate. If there is one message from me that you will see the study soon, we shall publish it. It will be your late night reading. But if there is one message I would like to convey, that it's high time we establish now a platform for coordination and action. So we are delighted by the study that we have consulted all the stakeholders, meaning governments, operators, private sector operators on, but I think it's time to move into action, and we would like to support it, maybe potentially lead it. But before I get there, two things, Jonathan, if you allow me. So there are things that the study calls soft measures, which I think are the hardest measures, and that is intergovernmental cooperation. And it means harmonization, and I think that somebody sitting next to me agrees with me very much, harmonization of customs documentation, transport documentation. Overall, it would increase already efficiency of existing network by fourfold. And probably, again, that will be the toughest thing, but it would provide already, without a tenge investment, better services, higher service quality. There will need to be increased competition among service providers. I look forward to hearing the view of KTG on the role of private sector operators in this section, in this sector, and also intergovernmental cooperation simply for interoperability of the network. Now, please read it and then forget about the figure that we give for estimated investment, which is between 18 to 20 billion euros. Because we haven't really looked into nitty-gritties of the Northern Corridor that you see there, needing there. And again, it was estimated that we came to together with the stakeholders that we arrived, but it's sufficient enough to scare people off. So first, it can be phased. We identify 32 priority investment, and it can be largely sliced and can be implemented in a period of 3 to 5 years. Number two, we do count on private sector participation, no, not on PPP railway lines, although Vibke might challenge me on that from IFC, but a lot to do with logistics centers, managing border crossing points, rolling stock fleet operators, so there's ample room, because this figure, Jonathan, it also includes rolling stocks that we need, yeah, containers that we need with increased containerization. So again, this is our vision. No, it doesn't stop at the Caucasus, because there are other studies that have already dealt with it. There are other opportunities that we are looking at, and For our next talk, we'll have a little coordination talk with ADB and the World Bank, how to approach it, and then again establishing a platform to launch ourselves into action. Thank you.
Shuja, thank you very much, and it is a great report, actually. I really enjoyed reading it when I saw it, and I'm sure if you get the chance to see it, you will too. Let me turn to you, Nurlan Surumbayev. This is, you would have a massive role in this as the railway operator, and clearly increasing the ability of the middle corridor to ship things, relies on heavy investment in the railway network.
Спасибо, Jonathan.
Thank you, Jonathan. I would like to greet you all, first of all. Welcome, and all the participants and guests. Our country is a unique one. We joke saying that in Astana, in one day, you can get tanned, and then in the evening, you can get your feet frozen, and it's within one day. And we're very glad that you are visiting our country, our capital city, and I can see a lot of partners among the audience, and we've been working with them for decades already, Vaptec and Alstom, and the domestic businesses are helping us a lot, and our board of directors is present here, and there's a big interest to this deal, and we are now all sitting here like one big good family, and the speakers who are speaking next to me, well, this is quite a representative group here, and we are very glad that we are represented like this today, and each one of us going by his or her own way in making sure that this corridor will start working. And then there are lots of questions that are asked, how we're going to develop it, and then lots of questions in relation of the cost. And the EBRD's work is the biggest work done, the most relevant one, and when the project was starting, the talk was about $1.5 or $2 billion, and then when later on, when 6 railway authorities got together and made an estimate, it was 6 billion. That was our estimate, and now we heard about 18 billion. And we should get down to implementing it as soon as possible, because it's going to grow more, I mean, in its cost. So we should be really getting down to this business until it becomes 30 or 50 billion dollars. And would have been very nice to get acquainted with that report. EBRD made a huge work, and further on when we will have an exchange of views session here. So this is a unique project, and it actually involves a lot of companies and governments, and without coordination with such big institutes like EBRD and others, it will be very difficult to implement it. So we got to this certain stage, and further it's going to be, of course, more difficult. And Mr. Zhao can then tell us about the macroeconomics. When I looked at this is about logistics. Again, about the logistics in China and the logistical chains in China. And then the keys are lying, first of all, I should say, in China and then in Europe. And we need support from Europe to make it going. And there should be political decision, political attitude, and will should be on China as well for this project to fly, for this middle corridor to come into existence. And over here we have a lot of issues to tackle as well in relation with this project. When Chairman Xi, he talked about this project for the first time 10 years ago in Astana. He talked about, and since then 100 times grew the circulation of containers. It's a huge, actually, increase, and within 5 months this year, 42% growth in transit. And for railway, the growth for 1 or 2% is already a challenge. When it's 42%, it's just the huge amount of work to do and tackle, because this railway network is not made of rubber. I mean, you should really enhance and grow it to make and again, another thing to tackle is the rolling stock. And then to which extent it's going to be long-term, this trend, it's another question.
На которых мы будем стоять пока. Да.
Thank you.
Поэтому я хочу сказать, вопросов у нас, Джонатан, у всех много, в том числе и у нас. И
Jonathan, we have a lot of questions, and we would like to have that on this dialogue platform. We would like to find the answers and exchange our opinions, and I hope that we will build this middle corridor in the best way it's possible.
3 o'clock, by 3 o'clock, we may have raised 20 billion euros. You never know. Vivka, let me turn to you. Actually, as one of the potential financiers in this region, you'll have an interest in the middle corridor. How do IFC see this?
Thank you. So now I'm a bit worried. I'm not sure I can promise.
What is your pledge today?
Exactly. But perhaps let me first say two things to begin with. I was here 2019 for the Astana Economic Forum, and it's such a pleasure to be back, and I will say I was very impressed yesterday. It really sunk in for me the rationale of expanding it into the international forum. So bringing, going beyond the purely economic dimension. And I'm saying this because I think that's very, very relevant for this middle corridor, and I'm sure we'll keep coming back to this. And then, Zsuzsa, I actually think it's great you put up this map, because I was wondering actually to ask what is actually the middle corridor. And I think from how we see it, and I imagine if we asked every single one of you, you would have sort of some vague idea what it could be. But I think seeing just a map, what the different corridors can be, starting to break it down into, let's say, something more concrete, projects is really big. Because with this, why I'm saying this is, I think in complexity, this is hard to top. And so this means for all of us, and I think as IFC, we are part of the World Bank Group focused on the private sector. We see a very huge role, and I think that's my big plea as we all together start really thinking, how do we start breaking down this complexity? How can we bring in a role for the private sector, not only when we hear the huge investment needs, and I think it's exactly what happens. The moment you make an estimate, the number stays. It's probably not 18 or 20. It's probably a different number. This is only the part that focuses only, I'm saying, on Central Asia. I, for example, also cover Turkey, and we know it goes much beyond. So my message is really the investment needs are huge. I think we will need all the stakeholders to come together. And I see a very, very strong role for the private sector to come in. If I may say, I think there is a lot of scope in this region to bring in more private sector participation. And for me, this is the huge opportunity. We stand ready. You may know we work globally across emerging markets. This is what we do. We do bring in, we do work with the private sector and sort of act as an interlocutor with the different public institutions. We do it, of course, together with the World Bank, with EBRD, with all the IFIs, and I think we're all needed. And if I just one more say, so it's the private sector for me, and it is an opportunity to do this in a sustainable, in really a green transition way. And not from, when we think transition, most of the time we think energy transition. Of course, that plays in. But I just really would like everyone to walk out and remember, as this is such a transformative program or endeavor, this is such an opportunity from the beginning to really do it in a sustainable manner. Thank you.
Wiebke, thank you very much. Yes, and of course that adds complexity to the whole project as well. Yang Zhao, from the perspective of Beijing, you know, looking at this, China will be involved potentially in so many ways.
Thank you, Jonathan. I'm very glad and honored to be here. As a macroeconomist, I would like to discuss a little bit about the spillovers, on the economic aspect, the spillovers from China as a large economy. With the success of China's open up and reform policy, which has been lasted for almost 4 decades, China has obtained a very rapid growth for quite long. And that ended up with China's GDP as the second largest in the world. And if we look at the manufacturing data, actually China has accounted about 28% of the manufacturing output of the world, while the US contribute about 16%. Japan is 7%. So when an economy reaches to that kind of size, it can, of course, it certainly will generate some spillovers and impose some impacts of the economies around. And if we enact some policy wisely and if we cooperate very well, we would expect that those spillovers could generate positive effects. So besides the well-discussed impact of China's trade, I would like to discuss 3 factors from those spillovers from China. First, capital supply. You know, when we talk about building infrastructure, we need a capital. And in macroeconomics, capital supply is determined by the savings, actually. So how much a country can save and how much a country has saved determine the capital supply. And if we look at the data in 2021, for the share of the world's total savings, China is about 30%, while the US is about 15% and EU is 17%. So China has certainly been a very large source of global saving. China actually has been a high saving economy for quite long. And early this century, China's saving ended up with very strong trade surplus as high as 10% GDP. Now China has kind of rebalanced its trade surplus down to 2%, around 2% of its GDP. And on the other hand, China has also rebalanced its trade surplus gradually from with developed countries to developing countries. And if we understand macroeconomics very well, we would understand that strong trade surplus will end up with strong overseas investment. I mean, China's overseas investment, a big chunk of that, very important part of that, actually is done by the central bank holding sovereign debts of other countries, like US. But now China started to rebalance its overseas investment from developed countries to developing countries. So here comes, 10 years ago, China started the initiative of Belt and Road, and China has done a lot of investment along the Belt Road initiative. So I think this has laid a very important foundation on the topic what we are discussing today. And the second factor actually is the finance capacity. We've seen increasing use of RMB in the international trade and investment settlement. Several offshore RMB centers have been built. And in the future, I think with China's increasing involvement of the regional economy, I think RMB will play a more active and supportive role in the trade and investment internationally. And finally, the third factor actually is technology innovation. According to the great economist Joseph Schumpeter, development can be understood essentially can be understood as technology innovation. And China has somehow built a national technology innovation system. And in particular, China has launched its very ambitious target to reach the carbon neutrality by 2060. It's a very ambitious target. And I think with that target, certainly will generate a lot of market demand for new technologies, particularly the green energy transition technology. So I think China can also contribute a lot on that front. And Kazakhstan and China actually are at the similar level in terms of development. If we look at the GDP per capita of the two countries, are quite similar. And the two countries also have quite distinct comparative advantage in the trade products. And the two economies are quite complementary to each other. So I think China and Kazakhstan and the country nearby, around this region, will have plenty of room to cooperate and coordinate in different aspects to generate a better economic development in the region. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Yang Zhao, thank you very much. I'm loving this conversation so far. About 40 years ago, I trained as an economist, so this is definitely speaking to my inner economist here. Let's dig a little deeper. We've heard those opening statements, but let's dig a little deeper into this. Mirek, maybe I'll come to you first with some questions. We've got lots of countries, we saw on the map, you know, how complex it is, all these countries which will have to cooperate. What will be needed, do you think, in terms of that cooperation to really make this work?
Thank you. So I mentioned at the beginning that we see these headwinds or shifting patterns in international trade. You could argue there is kind of less cooperation in the system right now. I think President Tokayev also mentioned it yesterday. But then you see some initiatives that are going against the trend. So you could argue that this one is going against that trend. Well, the other one that has been quite interesting, you may have followed, is the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which actually has now a lot of momentum. And that's 54 countries. So obviously, it's different. We are building here something that is quite concrete, and it's all about implementation. This is kind of a general first step, but just to underscore that obviously this is the life of people that are dealing with trade, that you deal with multiple stakeholders in multiple countries. Just to say that it's quite natural. And obviously, what was mentioned by my colleagues here, it would be, of course, helpful that there is some kind of a standing platform for dialogue. I think that would be important because, again, it was mentioned by many here, all kinds of things that could be done to further develop this and deploy it. From some of the measures that could be mentioned. So we do a lot of work globally on non-tariff barriers to trade. So people are very fascinated with the tariff issue, but there is a lot you can do to facilitate trade when you look at some other things like custom harmonization, and I think you talked about it already, so I don't want to repeat. But obviously, this is a huge thing. This is you can get a lot of things done if you have deployment of digital tools, so digitalization of these different processes at the border. That's one thing. Policy harmonization, another. So there are well-proven tools that are in the toolbox of people that work on those things globally that can be deployed here. The other thing, of course, is that it's related to what was said about the private sector, that the more it is connected and the more there is a bigger market around this, maybe other private sector players will be interested in this environment. So it's so important that you do achieve economies of scale around this corridor so that then additional private sector players in all kinds of industries will start paying attention to the middle corridor. That's why we also work on it, because we want to make sure that, given the strategic value of this project to Kazakhstan and other economies, that actors that are relevant in the global economy know about the project. Then, of course, the other thing is, just to underscore, it needs to be future-oriented. So the fact, I think my colleague from IFC mentioned it very clearly, that it's important that when something is being built, it's built for the future. And so again, being very clear that this should be sustainable, and part of those two transitions I mentioned is very important. Maybe the final thing, I don't know if you will ask someone else about it, but it's all very important, obviously, that it is not only a corridor, but it is an market system or economic system. So that people use this and the attention this is getting to actually not only do a corridor, but actually create an economic system out of it, at least a market system out of it, so that then other sectors which may not be necessarily related to transportation can actually benefit from this.
That sounds like an additional huge job on top of actually developing the corridor, but it's an interesting thought, actually, which I hadn't dwelled upon before. Shuja, if I come back to you, reading the report, there's so much in it. But a couple of things struck me. I mean, one is that clear need, and Mirek just pointed it in a way as well, to having a coordination mechanism across the whole route, across all the countries, to make sure things can run smoothly. And the other thing I thought was around digitalization and the gains that can be gained relatively swiftly, actually, if you can do that. Maybe you want to say a bit about that.
I think I already mentioned, and all others mentioned, the need for coordination, cooperation, and these are very banal cliches. A couple of aspects. So, as we know it now, the various operators, they need to strike individual deals with the individual asset owners, and the transaction cost is prohibitively high. So this is one of the reasons why this corridor is not used more. So not only Central Asia, but overall the middle corridor operators, if I may put it well, they could very much benefit from the establishment, and hold on to your chair, Jonathan, of a commercially oriented single corridor operator. So at least we would like to start a discussion, because again, the shippers, they would like to have one interface. When we go north of Kazakhstan, it's slightly easier, isn't it, to have one interface. So again, if we want to move forward and talking from the point of view of those who actually are shipping goods, and we discussed it last year in Samarkand, we were also connecting this region, the private sector operators would like to have as few interfaces as possible. Then among the countries, again, and we discussed it with one of our best partners in Kazakhstan, KTG as well, coordination and cooperation mechanism. So it needs to be even stronger than it is now, because there has to be a range of operational approaches that are harmonized, and it can start, as it is already largely the practice, on solving ad hoc problems, and then the closer we get to a kind of more formalized coordination mechanism, there is higher chance of enforcing actually solutions. And again, the gentleman sitting next to me might know more about it, but we only read about what Kazakhstan, Georgia, and Azerbaijan announced, a joint venture back in 2022. So any such initiative certainly help. I look forward to hearing about the implementation, whether it's governmental or through the associations, but these coordination, the rest, MDB cooperation, financing, this is nitty-gritty compared to the need to come closer on these three fronts.
And actually, I was really interested, Shuja, that you started by talking about the need for a single commercial operator. And I expect nothing less than the EBRD, obviously, to focus on that. But do you see as well a role for some sort of intergovernmental commission? Because, I mean, I always think, when I think about these grand cross-border projects, I remember the Eurotunnel project, for example, in the United Kingdom, when there was an intergovernmental commission actually between Britain and France to do that. So do you envisage something like that will be required to make things run smoothly?
That is one thing about the operator, yes, that works with the shippers along the corridor. I mentioned already the inter-operators coordination. I love intergovernmental commissions, but I would love them to focus on two things. One is the harmonization of various documentations, which is of imminent issue. And number two, occasionally see eye to eye in a very closed room, slightly smaller than this one, about priority projects. Because major companies like KTG, they would also like to hear where traffic would flow, how they need to face their investments. And again, going on, it needs to be on a practical basis. Just don't ask me whether it can be all the 5 countries or only 4. Thank you.
Yeah, we better move on from that. Shusha, thank you very much indeed. Nolan Soronbayev, you talked about some of the challenges, but I mean, how do you see those challenges for Kazakh Railways? I mean, this is an immense distance to be covered. We read in, I certainly read in the report that was produced, the bottlenecks that will need to be overcome. There are certain technical issues which need to be overcome. Finding the money to do all of this for rolling stock and for other things. When you think about it, this is a mammoth task.
Полностью согласен.
I fully agree with you. It's a hefty, big task, and this is all about infrastructure. And this trunk line is very expensive, and we have a clear understanding, and our projects became already part of our long-term plans. And the government and president fully support this, and we have money allocated for this. And I don't want to go into the nitty-gritty details, but all of those major areas that we want to tackle, they've been already financed. And the last project, the one was over $1 billion, 800-kilometer road between Dostok and Mointy. And then before that, we've been building that Kurik project. And just to show you on this map, and then our association been preparing this in order to develop these small rectangles mean the bottlenecks. And as over our territory, we're doing that, we're tackling that. The money was already allocated for that annually. We are planning to build about 600 kilometers of railroads, and then those bottlenecks that we have, we're gonna actually got rid of them, and we have already money matched to do that.
Thank you very much. Vibke, you talked in your opening statement about the private sector, and obviously that's IFC's role, a bit like the EBRD, to make sure that private sector can be brought into these projects. How difficult do you think will it be to interest the private sector in this sort of project? It's very long term, it has a number of challenges. How do you go about persuading them that this will be, potentially a good partnership?
Thank you, Jonathan. Actually, I've been observing clearly, just over the last, I would say, 1 or 2 years, clearly increasing, very concrete interest from the private sector. So that tells me that the opportunity that is there is being recognized. And I find that very encouraging, and I think we're seeing interest from really potential foreign investors, players from, not only from the region locally, but really quite internationally. So I think that's a very positive sign. I think then the question is what is needed to really bring them in. And I think, I'm afraid that brings us back to some of the broader challenges we're dealing with. I think any investor, what does any investor need? And when I say investor, I don't mean, these are not capital market investors. These are long-term investors. These are infrastructure players. I think everyone understands or comes in with that long-term perspective. What is, I think, always the key factor to attract is predictability. So I think, and then I'm afraid we do go back to, of course, the role government plays within projects that are just within a country, and then we add the cross-border international piece that I think can then make it a bit more complicated. I wanted to offer what I've been, and then I think with our team, and then together with the World Bank, what we've also been thinking, how to break this down. And I think you need engagement and actions on several levels. You do need, on the highest level, I think, some kind of intergovernmental, let's say, coordination platform, a dialogue, and I think that fits actually nicely with the theme of the forum here that stayed with me, tackling challenges through dialogue. And with it, you do need commitment. I think we know in the end, it always is actually quite simple. It boils down to commitment and it boils down to aligned interests. We see this between, I would say, the different governments involved. We will see this with the private sector partners. So that's, I think, just since there'll be so many topics everyone will deal with, I think it's important to come back to check in regularly. Do we have commitment and do we have some alignment of interests? But I think while that's happening, it's also important to, again, break it down and I think, Zsuzsa, you said, be practical. Start working with some concrete projects. I think there are a number of projects there that also we see a number of investors already working on that we're discussing with them. And that's, in my view, the very first or the next step that can help towards success, making it concrete. Show some results, and I always find when the results come and when the benefits start coming, that is then, that again has a positive impact on the commitment. You see the aligned interest and makes any dialogue easier and better.
And better. Vika, thank you very much indeed. Yang Zhao, a couple of thoughts, I guess, occur to me. That the first one is, how much does China really need this route in terms of getting its exports out? I think the other issue is, how does this work, as you see it, with the Belt and Road Initiative, which obviously, you know, the connectivity of that?
I think from China's perspective, this middle corridor has become increasingly important, particularly for the trade between EU and China. In context, particularly in the context of the Ukraine-Russian war, when the northern route actually, you know, have a lot of problem there. Again, as an economist, I would like to use some data to show you how things became. Last year, the volume of goods passed through this route increased 2.5-folds to 1.5 million tons. And China's imports and exports with the key middle corridor countries, notably Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkey, reached the US dollar 72.5 billion. So that's a more than 17 YOY growth. So I think it's quite important. And more importantly, there is plenty of room for China to expand the trade via this route. And as for the relationship between this route and the Belt and Road Initiative, I think it's quite naturally the mid corridor is dovetailed into the Belt and Road Initiative. The shared goal of the regional prosperity via infrastructure building and increase the connectivity among different countries has laid a very solid foundation for aligning these two projects. In 2019, the first cross-Caspian China-Europe freight train arrived in Prague, and next year, the first freight train successfully went from Istanbul to Xi'an, China. And more interestingly, I think Kazakhstan played a very important role in aligning the two initiatives. If we look at the data, Kazakhstan actually has more than 90% of the EU-China trade past the route actually past Kazakhstan. And also more than 90% of China's trade with the with EU under the Belt Road Initiative, according to the through those free trade, also pass through Kazakhstan. So Kazakhstan actually has been a hub city of both initiatives. And also the transit infrastructure connectivity is very important. And both initiatives emphasize on that front. So I think a lot of shared goals and shared interests between these two initiatives, and that creates a huge room for cooperation.
Thank you very much. Yes, so clearly it's going to be important to China. I think that's very, very evident. If I can come to you, Shuja. We've talked a lot about the challenges of this. You in your position sitting here overlooking all of Central Asia in your role, you're aware of just how demanding it can be to deliver big infrastructure projects in this region. How do you see that, and what are the mitigations as you see it? Can organizations like the Astana International Financial Center play a role? Can EBRD play a role in overcoming some of these many challenges on these big cross-border infrastructure projects?
So a couple of thoughts. First of all, as we discussed, there are distinct investment projects, and the easiest part is to do feasibility studies, environmental, because that's the routine work. But first, also in the context of what we heard from KTG, the companies themselves, they need to have the ability to prepare projects and then to take on financing. So one of the things which we would like to see mitigated finally, having tried it 8 years ago, is to change tariff and regulatory framework. Because, again, KTG can proudly say, the government is behind me, they provide me with the necessary budget resources. Uzbek Railways, they say, I've got the government, and they would provide the guarantee for the public sector investment part. I'm afraid it's not the case in Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan. So, again, there needs to be a review, probably led by these two countries, of the overall tariffs, and we can probably spend between the two of us 2 hours about the tariff structure that is still not reflective of economic cost recovery, high level of cross-subsidization. So that, for me, is a very important mitigant on the way to implementing these projects. And the governments simply need to think it through how they would like to subsidize whom. Hopefully not through KTG, but through then government means. Number two, there are also still, somebody used here the term at the forum, pragmatic optimist. So I'm an eternal optimist, but there are still unpredictable traffic volumes. And let's face it, the Russian corridor is still working, is viable, and for most shippers, this is the preferred option. So when we talk about these corridors, middle corridors, plural, if I may, this is not alternative. This is addition. This is where we expect the economic impact also to happen on countries of Central Asia. And thus, if I want to attract the private sector to invest with this slowly growing but still unpredictable volume, I need some credit enhancement. So again, once we shook hands with our friends in the EU that job well done, study delivered, I already kind of extended my left hand. So where is the support? Because, again, the EU introduced the so-called EFSD plus guarantee, although some of you would understand what it means, but it provides credit enhancement for private sector investments, make it more affordable against the risk that private sector would face. Now, there is a risk Jonathan, I ask you to mitigate, and this is the sanctions risk. Okay, so we live in a period of sanctions. You look at the ports of Aktau, for instance, and these are Russian and Iranian ships that are handled there. So If anybody would like to mitigate my sanctions risk, I would welcome it. We have discussed it also with Kazakh partners. The Caspian Sea is blessed with the riparian state it has. I cannot change it, so we need to find ways of how to approach, it might not be BRD's official position, but it's certainly mine, how we approach the expansion of Port of Akta. Facing the realities, we need to have more vessels, we need to have the capacities, but at the same time, we have to deal with these issues. And in financing, we are not alone. Again, apart from budget that Kazakhstan, I must admit, is blessed to, there are the MDBs. We see a strong role that we have been advocating also with export credit agencies. And last but not least, we very much count on China coming in. Yes, Jonathan, you would expect me to say, with projects that are fiscally sustainable, environmentally sustainable, and whatever, but again, it's not a lonesome project for countries of Central Asia.
And just one other thing then, Shuja, because I mean, if you think about some of these, the risks, we've already seen, I guess, I know it's outside your area because your interest, as you said, stops at Akta, but if you look just over the water at Baku port, you're seeing the port operators there jacking up fees for transit by many, many times. So what do you do about that?
Why do you think I mentioned the agreement between Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan and Georgia? They need to come to terms.
And do you think that's possible? Do you think that will be manageable?
I have not been privy to the commercial part of this.
Neither have I yet.
Political will is there, but
yeah.
it's 2/3 commercial, 1/3 politics.
Okay, yeah. Okay, Vivka, this is probably a good moment to bring you in actually as well here, because you're in the risk mitigation business for private sector investors as well. How do you see that?
So I was listening to Juja. I thought sort of the more financial risks, there are ways to mitigate them, and I think that's where I'm also quite what's the word, comfortable. I mean, there are instruments there. As part is, in how we structure, and I think that's always how we go back. We look at every project and structure and see who is actually best placed to sort of carry which risk, and I think that already is a big mitigant. Where, let's say, there are risks that, and again, coming back from my plea, so to say, to bring in the private sector whenever possible, there are, of course, a number of risks the private sector would not be willing to take. And then I imagine, apart from, political risk, sort of non-financial viability type risks, there are structures we will, I think, need to explore further. What type of, be it guarantee mechanisms are there? Is there some kind of, Juja, you mentioned what from the European Union, but I think generally it is, and I can say this globally right now, there's a big discussion around, where is what we call blended finance needed. I think this applies very much here, but I think this is not just in the context of the middle corridor. From what I'm seeing, given that risks are increasing everywhere, this is, I think, one very big theme where I think the international community is working on developing. The only thing where I'm then hesitating is the non-financial risks are much harder to mitigate, be it a sanction risk, be it sort of reputational type risks. I think that's then when we get into very difficult territory.
It's an interesting point you've just raised, Vivka, which has triggered another question in my mind, which is you talk about the blended finance priorities in effect. Of course, we know a lot of the priority for blended finance at the moment is around climate mitigation, green. So this project is competing, I guess, with that, even if this can be a sustainable project. So.
Well, it's interesting. I would actually think, and that's what I said earlier, often when we think of climate, yes, a big focus is on energy. But I would argue that I think transport is the other big sector where I think climate has a big impact. And again, I think making the case that making it as sustainable or as green as possible, I think that would certainly help. But you're right. I think you could almost say the other way around. If it's not green, it's probably almost sort of very low on the priorities.
Thank you very much indeed. Yang Zhao, let me turn to you. We've talked several times now about the importance of China in all of this. Do you see areas in this project where Chinese companies, where Chinese financial institutions would be interested in investing?
Yeah, actually, I think China has done a lot of investment in this area. By the end of 2021, cumulatively, China has invested $10.2 billion in 4 key countries along the mid-corridor. And the annual investment of that year, 2021, is $1.1 billion. So China actually has invested a lot. And if we look at the breakdown of the data, China invested in different areas. I think about 30% in the energy sector, more than 20% in chemical, more than 20% in transit areas. So definitely, I think with all those economic aspects I just laid in my opening speech, I think there will be pretty strong growth in this area. So we can only expect that more investment from China or some other related countries into this area.
And do you see it as being a balance of money coming from the state and the private sector in China? How do you see this balance of?
I would say most of these investment was done in the context of the Belt and Road Initiative, which started about 10 years ago. Actually, China have done overseas investment, particularly for this region, for this area. We can trace even a longer history. I think at the beginning of this century, when China entered WTO in 2001. So for the first stage of this period, most of the investment has done by the SOE from China. We're talking about the balance of the private and government sectors. But the SOE in China play a quite interesting role, even in the development of China itself. And we know that due to the nature of those investments, a big chunk of them are infrastructure, which is a little bit like public goods. So government actually do play a role in this area. And SOE is a pretty strong investment arm in China. However, I would say in future, I would expect more private investment from China into this region, because once the infrastructure has been laid, we need to think about the return of the investment, and we need to think about the sustainable growth, and that actually relies on the economic return of the whole region, and that depends on the technology innovation, that depends on the prosperity of the private sector for the whole region. So I think in future, we would expect more private investment from China. Actually, in the policy, China actually is encouraging more private companies to go outside of the domestic markets to invest more in the international market. And this hub region will certainly be one of the targets.
Thank you. That's interesting. Nolan, if I can turn to you and Kazakhstan Railways, you've got lots of cooperation at the moment internationally. You have cooperated, I think, in the past with China and with Singapore and the UAE. How important do you think will be this international cooperation for upgrading what you need to do here in Kazakhstan?
Well, in general, we are always open to cooperation. So for Kazakhstan, we have a unique geographical position, and with the companies that can increase our transit potential, give certain competence and load base, and we will be glad. We have historically good relations with COSCO Relingani. We have a joint project of dry port, and we have nice perspectives with PSA company, Abu Dhabi Port, Shandun Group. And we have, regarding the transformation of KTG itself, with Huawei, we have a project. So with all the companies who are ready to work on this corridor, we are working with them. And at the same time, we've got very good relationships with all the railway administrations of our neighboring countries and with all international organizations that are related towards Middle Corridor. And when we talk about big logistical companies, the market, the maritime market is already done, and it is already mature. And when I say like 100% more increase, and this, you don't have such numbers in the maritime transportations. And these big maritime transportation companies, they are going towards the land and see where they can apply their talents. And we are communicating with all of them, and we are ready for mutual cooperation.
You're going to have to expand quite substantially international cooperation for this project. There'll have to be more international cooperation.
Безусловно.
Absolutely, absolutely, because this is important. This is important because just in order to build the middle corridor the right way, during in European Parliament, we are there. We show everything because it's important for us that for EU, so that the middle corridor would become a priority project. And we invited the European ambassadors to our office together with development institutions, so that this corridor would be priority for them. And now, one of such strong development institutions, EBRD, it has become a coordinator because it's a very complex project to unite all the government agencies and harmonize their tariffs and etc. And one of the issues, logistics, is the same goods kind, And when you are selling the goods, it's a logistics good which has exact cost, which is stable, price which is stable, and then the terms, the timings. And regarding timings, we are okay. We can bring the load from China to Black Sea during 18-21 days. Everybody likes that. And second, we need to give a good price. And this price, in the framework of association that we are negotiating, once a year we discuss this price. And when big companies of China or Europe, they are looking towards this route, they need long-term perspectives. They don't want jumpings in terms of prices. And this is one of the main tasks when now we negotiate the price, and then the clients should give us the guarantee that after getting those guarantees, we address the development institutions if such guarantees will be from the bank. Then for development of middle corridor, we can get the money. And one of the most important issues today is the forming of a full-fledged logistical product.
Mirek, when you spoke earlier, you talked about a broader opportunity from this, that this is not just, as you see it, potentially a transit corridor. You can turn it into something more than that, something that has broader economic impact. I wonder what you meant by that, and how you think this could be developed into from a transit corridor to a broader economic project, a broader economic corridor.
Sure. Just maybe if I could react, and it's part of the picture. The gentleman from China mentioned that China built and if I remember, you said a national innovation system. So I'd like to underscore, we do happen to be working on now preparing a major summit. We call it Summer Davos in Tianjin, China. So I'm kind of very much in it. And just to say that this system, of course, sits right in the neighborhood. And so just for this region to be able really to think through how do I take advantage of that major kind of innovation ecosystem that is there. The other thing that also was mentioned, which I think is important, it's more of a technical thing, but we are seeing it globally, that the blended finance thing, because there was this thing where you mentioned, oh, is this then at the expense of this project? But actually, this is a major, as you know, momentum within the financial sector community and investors community globally. There is a increased deployment of blended finance toward climate ambition. But this is a main gateway for regions to be able to tap into that finance. So we're seeing that obviously in certain geographies, mainly in Africa, in Southeast Asia. But I would also like to encourage that, frankly, to be able to create a more of a forward-looking economic system out of this, that there is a heavy attention being paid to blended finance, and particularly within the kind of climate finance community. Then the other thing that I think is important, which I wondered whether we're going to get there or not, but we did. And we are an impartial organization and all that, but from the perspective of an investor, and I do work with, we have about 850 companies that we work with, the major companies around the world. And I was telling someone before this panel, so I happen to be talking to one company in a region that is completely not here. And I was surprised because that person told me, oh, I'm actually in one of the countries here in the region, partnered with a Chinese company and using some of the facilities that are here from the IFIs to do business. And it's a major investor in a country that is not here. And so just to me, this just sends the message of let's just maximize the infrastructure of different IFIs here and have really good facilities here, not only from one region, but really try to have as many of those, despite some of our headwinds geopolitically. Obviously, this region would benefit tremendously if there is more even coordination among them, so that then the private sector entities can come in even in a bigger way because they need the de-risking, they need some of those instruments to be able to be the long-term investors that would mention there. And finally, if I just can come back to kind of the platform thing, because I think it's important. Yes, you could say that you don't need that, or maybe it's difficult to do, and let's just get on with the work that we have right now. But you could also argue that for a real step change and for really making sure that this is more than just a corridor, you actually say it's worth the attention and the political capital that you spend on really creating, and I would say not only an intergovernmental platform, but really what we call the a multi-stakeholder platform. Because then if you are able to say, okay, these are the things that we want to do together, this is the vision, and ideally already up front you're also talking to some of the potential major investors so that they are not downstream from you, but you're communicating already upstream the vision. I think it could go a long way in realizing this journey from a corridor to a bigger economic system here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mirek, and thank you to all of our panel. I think that was a really fascinating hour or so, and I'm certainly left with the impression that obviously this is a hugely complex project. Will require major, as you say, political efforts, never mind the financial effort. But also I do get the sense, from those panelists who are directly involved, there's a lot of determination to try to get there. And it reminds me actually of a discussion long time ago when I was first in the EBRD, when we were discussing the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline. Now, and people thought that would be an impossible project. Well, it was done. So I think that should give us some hope. Thank you to all of you. Thank you very much to all of you in the audience as well. See you next time. Bye.